Good morning once again. Thank you for joining us. So we're just about to start our session. Uh, First of all, I wish to begin this morning by thanking you all for joining us here today. This shows a commitment amongst young people to the convening this morning. Young leaders, distinguished guests, friends, good morning once again. My name is Ray from Tanzania. I have an absolute honor and pleasure to be representing Yango this morning, and in particular the Climate Finance and Markets Work Group. And before I proceed, I wish to thank the very hardworking, passionate and hardworking colleagues from the Climate and Finance Work Group, as they have been able to make this all possible. Before we proceed, I wish to share a reflection with you all this morning. Climate change, as we all know, is real, and now we're facing an issue of intergenerational inequity, where young people will face most of the disasters and challenges as a result of climate change. Now, young people, at least 1.8 billion young people all across the world, will continue to face these challenges and impacts for many, many more years to come unless something meaningful and very intentional actions are done to adapt and, of course, slow down the contributions to climate change. So while young people are the majority stakeholders, young people continue to be excluded from decision making and decision making at the tables. So while we all understand and reaffirm the many actions that are required to be taken to address climate change, one thing is eminent: climate finance. And by climate finance overall remains to be an issue, remains to be inadequate. But in particular, climate finance for young people is even a bigger challenge. So climate finance for youth has many perspectives. But one thing that we can all agree is young people are not homogeneous. Young people are diverse. Young people has a number of challenges, but young people has an untapped potential. And it's very important that this untapped potential of the key stakeholders of this world, which are the young people, be fulfilled, and we need finance to be able to take our just and participate meaningfully to the climate equation and climate action. So the reason we're convening here this morning, we will be discussing, reflecting, and indulging in just this: climate action, young people, and climate finance for young people. With this, I wish to welcome my colleague, who will take us into an immersion of the convening here today and this morning. And I welcome you all. Jodi-Ann, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, bright and early at the Children and Youth Pavilion. My name is Jodi-Ann Wang. I'm a Canadian G20 Youth Delegate this year to G20 Indonesia, where I negotiated on behalf of Canadian youth on issues related to climate, environment, and sustainable finance. I'm also a senior climate policy analyst at the UN-supported Principles for Responsible Investment. And I'm very delighted to be your moderator for today's session. We've got a very excellent kind of squad of panelists ready to engage on this issue of how we can ensure intergenerational equity and the scale-up of sustainable finance. So without further ado, let me introduce them to you. First, we have Dr. Jessica Omukuti, who is a research fellow at Oxford Net Zero and a member of the UN High-Level Expert Group on the Net Zero emissions commitments of non-state entities. To Dr. Omukuti's left, we have Julie Segal, who is a senior climate finance manager at Environmental Defense and an associate of Youth Climate Lab. Next, we have David Carlin, who is a founder of Cambium Global Solutions. And last but certainly not least, we have Vadim Kuznetsov, member of BRICS Youth Energy Agency and the regional focal point for Europe for the SDG 7 Youth Constituency by United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth. Before we start, just 3 quick housekeeping items. The run of the show today will be, the panelists will chat for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll leave room for an open Q&A interactive discussion with the audience for the second half of the agenda. And each panelist, to save time for that interactive Q&A, I would like to ask that we keep our answers to each question about 2 minutes, if that's okay. And the last thing I want to say is the sustainable finance space has grown significantly over the past couple of years. And it has, with the rise of sustainable finance discussions, there's also been a lot of jargons and acronyms riddled into the discussion, making it quite inaccessible sometimes for members of the community who are not directly within the finance space. So we want to make sure today's discussion is as accessible as possible. So if at any time there is an acronym thrown out that you do not understand or you've never heard before, just wave your hand and we'll pause and give it a quick 1 or 2 minute explanation and move on with the discussion. So, without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Omukuti, I would love to go to you first. As I mentioned earlier, the space of sustainable finance has grown significantly. It's been a year since COP26, where the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero was formed. And yesterday, the panel that you are on, the UN High-Level Expert Group, scrutinizing the integrity of net zero emission commitments from non-state actors, published its report with 10 recommendations. So to help us get a lay of the land and the context in which we're having the discussion today, can you tell us a bit about what has been the greatest challenges and opportunities to ensure integrity by financial institutions?
Nope. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. And a bit closer. Yeah, that's better. Yeah. So where do I start? So I was asked to be a member of the high-level expert group earlier this year, and I was probably the youngest. I am still the youngest, although the expert group was we achieved our mission yesterday. The UN Secretary General accepted the recommendation and endorsed them. But being part of that group was quite interesting because I was able to bring in not just experiences from maybe the youngest, I think, so kind of the youngest generation, but also an experience from the developing countries. And so I work on net zero, but we're really critical of the net zero concept. We ask whether net zero works for developing countries and the global south. And that came up, and I think the concern for net zero was more prominent after COP26, as you've heard, because financial institutions, businesses, but also cities and regions announced net zero targets. One of the issues here is that we saw a lot of commitments from developed countries. And so when we went into the high-level expert group, we were concerned that developing countries, the global south, was really not represented in considerations about what net zero looks like. But also there was a very huge intergenerational justice component that was lacking in it. One thing I would like to highlight is financing, which is the topic of today. There was a lot of commitments by, for example, G funds. There was about 130 trillion by COP26, and that has increased significantly by now. But then we were not sure where that finance would be spent, on who that finance would be spent on. And so there was very limited clarity about how much that finance would go to developing countries or the global south, which groups would receive those finance allocations, but also what sectors would be allocated. And through the high-level expert group, we've been able to kind of provide directions on what companies, financial institutions, and cities and regions should be investing in. For example, we've identified that gender should be a very important component of net zero transition plans. We've also identified that sectors that have a link to nature, which is very important for the global south, should also be prioritized. And so we say that companies that are planning on making investments, for example, in offsets or credits, should prioritize places that are most in need of financing, should prioritize groups that are also most in need of financing. For example, as there's the youth, there's also women, and also people with disabilities who are usually left behind when we're thinking about climate action. One other thing that we're seeing come out from conversations on net zero is, and this I'm really proud of this, is inclusion of youth voices in boardroom discussions, corporate discussions on how net zero should be structured. And so at COP26, I was part of a set of events that are called Boardroom 2030. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. And so it is where boardrooms, we imagine boardrooms, well, not we, people imagine boardrooms in 2030. And they say that in 2030, we will need voices that are currently the youth of today. And so instead of waiting for 2030, why don't we just ask the youth of today to come in and advise us today so that we're ready for the boardroom of 2030? And so we have a few corporations that are taking that up, and that is kind of very positive, but it's not that far sweeping. And so it's very specific organizations, and we're hoping that that will be taken up much quicker. Do I have more time?
Yes, but I can ask a follow-up question to keep that discussion going. You mentioned that there's a lack of clarity right now from the private sector on where they're investing, how they're investing, to what ends, right? We're talking about bond maturities now ranging between 1 to 30 years, and shareholding lasts sometimes only for months. So that it's really clear that the investment decisions that are made today will have impacts for not only the current generation or the current energy security crisis that we're discussing, but also for future generations to come, whether that's in critical technologies, infrastructure, or fossil fuels. So, and you mentioned boardroom by 2030, but what is needed then to embed intergenerational equity more systemically speaking in investment decision-making and considerations?
I think one is an awareness that we need intergenerational equity, so recognition. So I did climate justice, and recognition is quite important. We recognize that we need voices of the future in the present. And then once we've done that, we have to go further and make sure that the voices that are into these spaces are heard, because you know what you'll need for 2030 or 2040. But also we need processes that allocate responsibility equitably. And a very good example is responsibility for carbon sinks. And so we're investing a lot in permanent and temporary carbon sinks, with the expectation that you or your children who will be born in 10 or 20 years will be responsible for maintaining those things. And so ensuring that responsibility is equitably allocated and making sure that future generations are not taxed for the actions of the current generation and the past generation is quite important. And so the high-level expert group actually puts those considerations into recommendations. And so we talk about what investments should look like in carbon removals, but also we talk about what companies should be thinking about when they're thinking about reporting, transparency, and goes into governance and accountability too. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I will now go to Julie really quickly for the next question, just building on what Dr. Omukuti has just said. The UN Special Rapporteur on Promotion and Protection of Human Rights recent report highlights that there's a serious disconnect between those that continue to support the fossil fuel economy, which can include corporations or institutional investors, and those that are most affected by the impacts of climate change, which includes youth. So my question is, how do we then bridge this gap between the spaces of youth climate action and sustainable finance, while in this process putting intergenerational equity in the center?
Thank you, Jodi-Ann. This mic's super. So, I mean, I'm so glad that you named a disconnect there, because that's really what's happening. Inequity of all kinds, inequality is the root of the climate crisis, because it's separating those who are powerful from those who are vulnerable, those who are making decisions to continue funding fossil fuels, pollutants that are damaging our climate, and those who are going to bear the burden of it, whether it's future generations or a division between global north and global south. So, now moving into, the different kinds of finance and how finance plays a role in that. A lot of the conversation outside of this room here at COP is about loss and damages, delivering on 100 billion that was promised from wealthier countries to less wealthy and more vulnerable countries. What we're talking about here is specifically investment, private finance, right? To take a step back there. And the global financial system was not designed to advance climate equity, to advance equity of any kind, to advance climate action. The financial system at its core is for profit, efficiency, and there's a lot of, certainly positive things that can come out of having a transaction in a market function in our economy, but it's not the root, it's not the goal to advance equity and climate justice. So we need to kind of broaden our perspective when we're talking about private climate finance, when we're talking about kind of connecting that intergenerational equity and sustainable finance to think, how do we need to change the financial system? What needs to happen here? One key point, a lot of the focus to date has been on disclosing emissions or disclosing the impacts of what an investment is having. And we're really at a point we have to move away from that to talk about alignment. And that's what the high-level expert group report, the net zero guidance is talking about. How do we stop just saying what we're doing and we change what we're doing for positive action to make sure that we're aligned with keeping warming below 1.5 degrees. I can perhaps pause there and pick up on it later.
Yeah, hello? Just on that point of changing the system. Am I getting feedback? Check. Okay. Just on that point earlier about changing the financial system and the way that we're thinking with a systemic approach. We often hear the word an enabling policy environment, right? Policy as a role to shift investors' thinking and to create that policy environment for them so as to unlock the financial system-wide transformation towards what we call sustainable outcomes. That's a mouthful to say. So can you just kind of distill that for us a little bit? What does it mean? What is the role for policy here? Can they play a role in helping to kind of promote system-level transformation?
Happy to cover that. And when we're talking about policy for the financial system, what we really mean is accountability. Moving back to the conversation about disclosure versus alignment. A year ago at COP26, as we mentioned, multiple financial institutions signed on to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero to talk about how do we actually move to net zero. But just a few weeks before this COP, that voluntary commitment body distanced itself from the UN backed science for what it means to net zero. So we've seen calls coming forward, like from this report that my colleague Jessica was involved in, saying, no, here are the firm rules that mean a credible net zero climate commitment. So that's a really important baseline, but we're still missing the question of accountability. So, all of our countries that we're here, as part of, are accountable to each other under the Paris Agreement to some degree. But the private sector isn't under that same, it's debatable whether the private sector is still under that same gauze. So all of the financial system in most countries is regulated, has some policy overlay on it to some extent. So now is the time for us to include climate under that remit to make sure that the financial system is serving the benefits of intergenerational equity, international equity, and climate action. Maybe one quick piece to add there. I was talking about financial policy specifically for accountability, but as well, it's so important to safely put pressure on our governments to move forward with all kind of climate action policy. Because as governments move forward, it changes the imperative for what financial institutions have to do. So there's direct policy that's saying you as a financial system should be operating in a way that serves a livable planet. And then there's indirect policy too, making climate action happen so that everyone else has to follow.
I want to add a third dimension in here, talking about climate and finance, but then add in the dimension of development and the need for both international and intergenerational justice. So I would like to go to Vadim for this question. For BRICS countries and the broader developing economies as a whole who lack the finance yet have the greatest output capacity for climate mitigation and or adaptation and building resilience, what is then needed from your perspective to ensure that sustainable finance flows within and to the global south is aligned with broader development and climate goals?
Yeah, thanks a lot for bringing this up. In fact, we are now finding ourselves amidst a paradox situation when we have the global north, where finance is mostly concentrated, and we have the global south, where finance is mostly needed, but where it is lacking. Every single dollar of additional input of finance, of sustainable finance, not only climate finance, in fact, that you invest in the global north, now brings less impact on the overall well-being of the planet than if, in comparison with our investment in the global south, just because the potential remains so untapped that every dollar we invest brings a lot more impact in terms of overall climate mitigation, but also adaptation at the planetary scale. In this regard, a paradigm shift is important because up until recently, global south countries were predominantly viewed as financial aid recipients, but once we talk about aid of any kind, we lack agency because once you receive something, it is controlled by those who send you something. To make this paradigm shift work for sustainable finance in the global south, which is eventually one of the key pillars of our mutual well-being because we inhabit the same planet, there are some financial tools and policy innovations that could be introduced or could be scaled up since they already exist. Just to outline this very briefly, to give you a quick overview of what also us at G20 Youth Summit, what we thought could be useful. First of all, we need to remove existing barriers for financial flows between jurisdictions. Because once we talk about global south countries requiring more finance for sustainability projects and climate-oriented projects, we oftentimes think of global north giving something to the global south. In fact, even within the global south, there are now financial powerhouses that are capable of creating horizontal lines within others in the same, let's say, in the same dimension. Also, emission trading systems is an example. Many global south countries and economies of scale such as China have set up their national emission trading systems. Why don't we think of integrating them in a way that exchange of carbon units is facilitated and becomes easier for those who are ready to do that, so that finance flows within carbon-intensive jurisdictions and helps mitigating those things that are currently outlined as priorities for that or that region or industry. Next point, something on contingent debt liabilities. It is an interesting point since some countries, by attracting finance for climate and sustainability needs, might not be able to pay them back at the right time in the given time frame. And we do not want to make sustainable finance a punishment. In this regard, contingent debt liabilities could be an answer just because they are linked, this type of policy is linked to an unwanted event that might occur, such as natural disaster, such as, so events of this type. And if this occurs, the investor knows that we are not going to request it back right now because this country is just unable to pay, and we do not penalize this sort of inaction because it is justified, and it depends also on natural disasters. So in this regard, there are some policy tools that currently might be scaled up and implemented, but one of the key areas of tension regarding that is the paradigm that I briefly mentioned, is the paradigm of Global South being a mere recipient of finance aid, which is not like this anymore. It doesn't work like that anymore. And us sticking to that paradigm might be the main hurdle.
Great, and we'll come back to the point on development in a second. I want to go to David for my next question to round off the panelists. we heard a lot about accountability and transparency and needing more clarity. So how does the tracking and disclosing of progress of the private sector, so that's corporates and investors specifically, facilitate this needed shift in financial flows towards sustainability aligned activities? I'm thinking of, probably the jargon that's on the tip of everyone's tongue, TCFD or ISSB, Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure. What does it mean? How do these disclosure mechanisms take us one step forward?
So I think you said that really well with the idea of one step forward. And when we think about the creation of some of these climate disclosure standards, you had mentioned Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that had been put together by the G20's Financial Stability Board back in 2015, when it then issued its recommendations in 2017. The idea was really a very market-driven view that if everyone has the right information about climate and climate risks, we'll make better decisions. We won't be underpricing climate risks. We won't be pushing risks into the future that are going to compound and get more severe. We need to be operating from as clear a perspective as we possibly can. And I think that that is really the key, and the idea here is not just that this is a reporting and disclosure exercise, but that this is an informational exercise. Those who have that information and use that information are going to be the ones to make better decisions and to thrive. And ideally, through that marketplace of exchange, those that are managing their climate risks better, those that are taking advantage of climate opportunities, will be the ones that are successful. But I do want to stress, getting back to that point, that it is one step, because disclosure alone, even the use of those disclosures, is only part of the puzzle. We know that what has to happen is really a three-part connection between risk management, climate alignment, and financing of both mitigation and adaptation. And the financial sector is not off the hook when it manages its own risks. It's not off the hook when it commits to net zero. It's not off the hook when it puts together a sustainable finance framework. Each of those pieces is intersecting and interlinking. And so we don't have the time to wait for perfect certainty, for markets to work these things out. We need the efforts of governments and the private sector. We need to look at innovations like blended finance. We need to be thinking about ways to consider how this systemic change takes place. And I think it's once we realize that it's not just enough to do a good report, it's not just enough to set a good target, but that each of these things are not sustainability items, but they're strategic items, and they sit at the heart of what a financial institution should be doing in the 21st century and needs to be doing if they're going to be promoting a resilient and sustainable and equitable future.
And to build on that, I think one of the issues that we're facing when it comes to disclosing this information at the moment is that different jurisdictions mandate different types of disclosure. And since COP26, there's been conversations happening around the International Sustainability Standards Board that hopefully builds a baseline. So could you tell us a bit more about why is there a need to harmonize these standards, and what do we do in jurisdictions where maybe ESG regulations or guidance or disclosure guidance has not really been at pace with the speed of the overall movement?
Yeah, it's a terrific question because it's something that is so unbelievably timely, topical. Just yesterday, the International Sustainability Standards Board, called the ISSB, which was created at COP26 and aims to harmonize disclosure standards for climate and sustainability. They, along with CDP, which formerly was the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is one of the places where companies can submit their emissions for better tracking, they have now announced in the CDP disclosure that they will be following the ISSB guidance. And so this coalescence of global standards, sorry, cut out for a second, it is really important because fundamentally it seems like it's a very dry topic, but when we really think about it, we need to be creating the right incentives in each part of the world. We're talking about a globalized world with global supply chains and global financial institutions. And so what this means is we need to be speaking a common language when it comes to how we measure our risks, how we account for our emissions, how we consider the financing that we're providing, what is really green versus not. And so when we do that, and we do it in a coherent way, we facilitate that cross-border, that international, and that global connectivity, which is so important. I would also say the last piece on this, which is that I think it's really essential and really critical to see not only that standards are coalescing, but that those that are in places where those standards maybe haven't yet been developed can learn from and get up the curve faster from the work that is being done. And I think a wonderful example of this actually is in the development of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. I've worked with some of my colleagues who have been supporting the TNFD, and one of the big things is how do we learn from the framework of TCFD? Same with the work on the International Sustainability Standards Board. How can we learn from what's come before to build that coherence and get up the curve? And the same applies in places that have not yet mandated disclosure, that have not yet assessed what kinds of climate risks they face. We can learn from each other, and I would say more than that, we need to learn from each other on these topics because we have to move faster, and we're going to have to be figuring these things out as we're taking the actions that we need to take.
Thank you, David. I just wanted to open up to the panel and see if anyone wants to respond to anyone's intervention earlier before we open up to the Q&A. Sure.
So just a story. You've heard, if you follow climate finance, you've heard the stories of 100 billion developing countries, and then there's private sector investments that will unlock the trillions. And where the narrative is the same. You know, there's the need for greater finance commitments from developed countries. There's also here at the COP, there's discussions about how to encourage investments, and the high-level expert group recommendations kind of narrowed in on that. But we just completed some work that found that corporations in Africa, some of the we kind of tracked 250 of the largest publicly listed companies, and we found that half of those had emission commitments. And that sounds normal, you know. Companies are committing towards reducing their emissions. But within those commitments are commitments to finance climate change, to finance protection of forests, restoration, to finance renewable energy. And here you find the most interesting thing is that almost half of those institutions were financial institutions. And so if an institution is committing towards financing restoration of forests, financing renewable energy, then that is an opportunity to direct that finance towards climate action. But the problem is, here's a disconnect. The youth are not investors. And so most companies are more accountable to their investors. And unless you're really wealthy here, I don't think you've invested in any company so far. And so those financial institutions that are making commitments are not accountable to you. You're a client, you're buying their products, but they're not accountable to you. And so we should move to a point where institutions are accountable to both their investors, but also their clients, because they do make a lot of products for the young people. I remember I used to be marketed, savings accounts for young people 18 to 35. And so as an investor and also as a client, I think companies should start kind of creating products, not really products, kind of making commitments that are both transparent. And so we'll have mechanisms that require these companies to be transparent. And as clients, you should be holding these institutions accountable and asking them, you committed to this, so tell me about that. But also, you making decisions on which company to engage with, based on how well they're performing against their net zero standards or their net zero commitments. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of a movement thing where we're saying that we'll ask more of them because we're not their investors, but we're their clients and they owe us. Yeah.
Maybe just to say one more thing, building on that, because I think it's a terrific point, and speaking directly to those here as well as listening in, I think there's a lot of discussion, especially post-global financial crisis, about for financial, maybe, can I swap with you? This one seems better. So there's been a lot of talk about the need for financial literacy, and I think extending that idea of financial literacy. Of course, people should understand, and especially young people should understand the idea of debt, of interest rates, of these various credit vehicles that are often shown, the risks as well as benefits of investment. But I think another part of that education, that financial literacy, is about sustainability. And it means thinking, and I think this is actually a place where young people are ahead of many of the financial firms in their awareness of these things. So in the same way that many people are needing to learn what the various financial skills are for them to be successful as young adults, I think another part that shouldn't be forgotten is this commitment to sustainability. And that means not only asking the questions about, is this just, is this fair for me, but also when you work with a company and they have a pension, or you work with a company and they have a retirement account, is there a sustainable option? Is there a fossil fuel-free investment option? Also, when you work with getting your first credit card or your first bank account, what is that bank doing on financing fossil fuels? What is that credit card company doing on supporting resilience in the local communities where it's operating? These are questions that I think you are better than almost anyone from a generational standpoint at knowing that need to be asked. And I think it is a place where we as younger people can empower ourselves. So as we learn about finance, as we learn about how to make financial decisions, I would say we can also teach and we can also demand that these products, that these services, that these institutions live up to the standards that we have, because we are the consumers both of today and increasingly of tomorrow.
Thank you, David and Jessica, for that intervention. I'm conscious of time, so I want to open the floor up for any questions from the audience or any comments on what was said on the panel.
Thank you. I think I had questions for almost each panelist, but for the sake of time, I'll just ask a general question. And this is all about being environmental conscious. We are talking about finances, and we as young people have to be there to speak about this, to tell people about this. And the question is, are these finances being channeled to the right hands? Are they getting to the right people? If it means it's young people, are they getting access to those finances? Or are we just talking about the ticking of the boxes? We are being there representing and just said, oh, young people are here, the box is ticked. Are these finances coming to us? And if yes, where are they going to? Because for me personally, we are talking about climate finance. I never know where the money goes. I don't know what is happening. And most young people have no knowledge about that. You just go there, sit in a meeting, be there, take pictures, and that is it. Where are these finances going to? Thank you.
I'm happy to start since I have the mic in my hand, and then I'll pass it to a colleague who's keen to join in. But that's a perfect question, because there's a huge gap of funding for young ideas, young innovation. There's 2 points of it, right? If our current financial system gives power to shareholders, young people aren't coming with exorbitant wealth to put in and have that control. So we need to question who they are accountable to. The other question is finance flowing out. There's not enough money going to young people. Every one of you here has brilliant ideas that can help move us forward on climate change, and that's hugely underfunded in terms of private finance, in terms of philanthropy. And then the last question is representation, right? If we're talking about getting young people at boards, if we're talking about getting young people to perhaps be influencing the direction of money so that it can end back in the hands of young people, we need to move so far beyond representation. It's not just having someone at the table, it's making sure that person is empowered and listened to, so that all of those questions that were just raised about young people not getting finance, being tokenized, all of those have to be addressed. And we need to move beyond just getting young people there and making sure that they're having the power to make influence.
Yeah, just to quickly catch up on this, on what you mentioned. I would draw a a line, a parallel with just transition partnerships, which exists at the level of countries, and South Africa is a vibrant example of that. Now the key message behind just transition partnerships is co-management of finance that is assigned to projects within such partnership. It's not only your donor who decides how and what you spend and what are the time frames for that to be spent. It's also you as the entity, as the country hosting this finance and receiving this finance, designing its future implications. I guess the same must be applied to young people who obtain finance for concrete projects, for example, which are climate, energy, nature-based solutions oriented. As a quick takeaway from the everyday practice at the SDG 7 Youth Constituency by the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to not only connect young people who have projects to be implemented but lack finance to do so with those who have this finance in the international, let's say, donor and private space, but also then we try to make sure, and we do make sure sometimes it gets a bit tense in terms of discussions, but still it's a noble goal, that young people expecting this finance to contribute to their project are co-owners of this finance, and they are co-designers of the entire scheme of this finance applications. I think this is the way to go. Otherwise, it makes very little sense to say that we engage young people.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Sambo Kinde. I'm from the Gambia. I've been following, discussions on climate finance for a while. But my understanding so far is that one of the biggest problems that young people are encountered with is accessibility to climate finance to be able to embark on projects. But I think one important thing that we need to also bear in mind is that you cannot ask for something that you don't know. And it's very important for young people to understand the climate process. They need to understand climate science in general. Because one thing that is very important is that whenever you write for projects, the projects are expected to be bankable. You cannot write a bankable project if you don't understand, you don't have an understanding of what you are actually requesting for. So that shows the need for capacity building in terms of accessing climate finance to be able to implement projects at national level. So we have this component of the UNFCCC process. And I would definitely suggest that people should actually support this Action for Climate Empowerment component of the UNFCCC process, which basically deals with capacity building and a lot of other activities. So I think when it comes to accessing climate finance, a lot of money could be channeled through this process, and because countries are actually requested to select or to nominate focal points that will actually convey information regarding capacity building on climate change and so many other things through this is component of the UNFCCC process. So when it comes to accessing financial resources to be able to implement projects, I think this capacity building component of the UNFCCC process is also very important, that young people should be trained in order to be able to effectively contribute to climate change issues. Not necessarily climate finance per se, but anything that has to do with climate change in general. It's very important that young people are trained. It is through that process that they will be able to write bankable project proposals. And then also there are a lot of loopholes that people exploit in order to actually escape their financial commitments, because there are a lot of procedures that people need to undergo in order to access this finance, because you will be asked to work with an accredited entity, so accessing this, it becomes very difficult for those people that do not have the capacity at country level to be able to access, because sometimes they'll say you need to work with people that have experience in this. So it's very difficult for national governments to some extent to be able to have access to finance, because they do not have the capacity in country to be able to access finance directly. So when it comes through an accredited entity as well, those people also have, they take their administrative cost. So if, let's say $50 million is given to Gambia to implement a project, in reality, the government does not have access to the 50 million because they are working with people that also need, to use part of the money for their administrative, it's called administrative costs, I don't know, but I know there is some percentage of money that is given to the accredited entities. So in reality, it does not become, the 50 million that is claimed to have been given to a particular country, because they are working with people who also have their staff, who have their existing structures, and then they will also need part of the money to be able to implement the project. So thank you very much.
Would any of the panelists want to respond to that? Yes.
Just simply, there's two ways that power is transferred. It's given, but also it can be taken. Waiting on the UNFCCC and waiting on the JAS and the GCF, you're waiting to be given the power. I see private sector being a very good opportunity to take power. And so read the sustainability reports, find out what they plan on doing, and then ask them if they've done it. And then take to them a very good idea and tell them, you said you'd spend 200 million on this. This is a good idea. We want you to fund it. And so that's where you take the power from them. And so the requirement for transparency, accountability, reporting will work for both yourself, but also for them, so that there's greater transfer of finance towards projects that work for you, but also that work for much younger generations.
Really quickly, and then I'll take 3 questions at once, and we have to close the panel.
Sure, yeah. Perfect. I just wanted to add on to that, because we've talked about your power as potential shareholders, as consumers, but I'd like to call to all of you that everyone here is much more than that. You're also a citizen. I recognize that every government, every country has a different style of government and different degrees of respectful engagement with its citizens. But if we're talking about holding the private sector accountable for delivering climate finance, that's such an important lever. So let me be clear that at this point, every single investment that's made is an impact investment, and if it's not moving towards climate justice, it's holding us back. So we need to make sure that we're holding accountable for progress on every single investment that's being made.
All right, we'll take 3 last questions, 1, 2, 3. If you could keep it really brief, and we'll take it all together and address it at once.
I appreciated what you said about taking the power. I wanted to propose a question to you all about, we're talking about being shareholders and being constituents, but we're talking about like accountability for decisions in these spaces, but do y'all see a future of youth making decisions for finance, for climate finance, like actually making the decisions, youth making the decisions to fund youth, like some sort of fund that allows youth to make the decisions ourselves? Is that even possible?
Some sort of fund that allows youth to make decisions for ourselves.
Thank you. Hi. I don't come from a finance background at all. I work with young people who are very passionate about like climate action and nuclear disarmament. So I guess my question is more like a practical advice. So we've had discussions in the UK where I'm based with the young people who are really wanting to know, sorry, about this, responding maybe to David, what you were saying, and some about the power from private stakeholders. So the youth that I work with are very interested in kind of looking at where their savings accounts are, where their current accounts are, and making sure that their money is not being invested into nuclear warfare and sustainability, climate action. So how to find out where, like these institutions, these banks don't really post their ethical and sustainability credentials. So it's very difficult to find out that information. And so if you have any advice on how to maybe, how I can, bring information to these youth to support them to make like more decisions that align with their standards and values, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, I'll try to be quick. So, social entrepreneur working on a climate positive project, looking for finance. There's no access to finance, we all agree, amazing, risky world, whatever that is. Changing the perspective. How do I leverage blended finance tools Which kind of tools should I build on my own to access finance?
3 questions, if anyone wants to answer any parts of it or all of it.
Maybe I'll try just a quick fire. I feel like we could have a panel probably on each of them. So, recognizing that. So I'll try to say a few things in closing and then eager to give it over to my fellow panelists. On the first point, I think it would be a terrific idea to have a youth climate fund. I think young people are the innovators. I think that there's an ability to be in touch with the communities where you grow up. There's an ability to think in a new way that is paradigm breaking and paradigm shifting. So I think it's a terrific idea. I think there's also a tremendous need for financing of climate education, and not just about one type of this, but really a systems approach to understanding the science, but also understanding the solutions. We need people. I have a lot of friends in higher education, and I often talk about what do we want people to be coming out of the master's programs, these graduate programs. What do we want them to be doing? What part do we want them to play? So I think that's another critical area. On the second point, maybe just really briefly to couple is going back to the reliable microphone. A few resources there, because it is not always so easy. And this is why disclosure is so important. This is why transparency is critical, because you have the right to know, and I would almost argue you have the obligation to know what your bank, what your asset manager, whoever you're working with, what they're exposed to and what they're doing. But there are some great organizations, a lot of them in the NGO community, Bank Track, Share Action, Universal Owner, Reclaim Finance. It's not that they get it right all the time, but they are the ones that are lifting the veil on who is financing what. There was a great article in the Bureau of Investigative Journalism about how a lot of sustainable quote-unquote finance is going to just perpetuate traditional forms of fossil fuel extraction. So being informed, these are places that hopefully make it easier by doing a lot of that legwork. And then finally, the last thing on access to finance, I think it really is about risk and about perception. And the risk part is where the blended finance piece comes in, where government guarantees, where backing of state actors can be so important at the early stages to de-risk projects, especially if you are an investor coming from another country and you don't necessarily know the lay of the land as well. One of the biggest areas of confidence is going to be getting that government backing. Then finally, I would say on the other part of climate finance and scaling this, I think it's really critical to change the perception. We're going to need to be financing a different world than we were. That world may have more risks, it may be more early stage, but it's also going to be more vibrant and innovative. But I think continuing to push that educational message and that knowledge, both to investors as well as others who control capital, is going to be part of the shift as well. So sorry if that was too long, but hopefully I can hand off to someone else with thoughts.
If anyone else wants to give really quickly, because we have to close the panel. If any.
Yeah, just a quick remark on the question on financing nuclear. In terms of financing energy sources of the future, we do need to shift away from assessing emissions only, because if emissions is the only factor that we assess, we might end up following things that lead us to an impasse. And I'm not referring only to nuclear, which, for instance, has an issue of post-cycle storage of nuclear waste. But it also concerns renewables in terms of critical minerals extraction. In many parts of the world, mining sites are not compatible with ESG metrics of any sort. And in order for us to make sure that these renewables, for instance, are really green, not only at the moment when they get to the end consumer, once it produces no CO2 emissions, wow, it's green. We need to make sure that it's sustainable through the entire value chain, which starts at the mining site. And the same applies for nuclear energy in this case, which means that there is no toxic waste polluting our environment. But of course, while working, the power station did not produce any CO2. This should be a part of this paradigm shift when we assess energy sources of the future.
Great. That has been a really fruitful discussion. I think we can go on for a couple more hours if we wanted to. But the panelists, we might hang around for a bit afterwards. Feel free to just keep the conversation going around the pavilion. I want to extend my thank you to all the panelists for joining us today, and I want to pass it to our rapporteur, Duncan, to give a wrap-up closing remark and the next step that we'll take following this panel.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity to meet these great panelists, and Jodi-Ann, you've done a great job to this big group. To a quick one, as a Pan-African activist, the interest of the children is coming to be seen, and the children are getting to be so disturbed. If you look at whatever is happening all across the globe, we are at a position that we can realize there is change, and the climate is really impacting more so on the children and the mental health. Now, to quickly wrap up, this is coming that the interest of we as the youths, we want to fight for and advocate for children and the young people to be having access to funds, and probably to whatever add our panelists have put across, it is indeed that we need to put the negotiations across. By the time I was meeting the group of negotiators from Africa and the chair of the UNFCCC, this was something that wasn't into consideration. But once we raise our voices, I want to believe that it will come out clearly. Thank you all for listening to these great discussions, and back to you, Jodi-Ann.
And as part of the output from this panel, we don't want the discussion to just stop here. So amongst the co-organizers, we'll be compiling notes and discussion points from this session into a recommendation write-out that we will want to send to financial institutions and standard setters coming from youth on what needs to be done to ensure intergenerational equity in sustainable financing. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.